Okay, good morning, everybody. So moving on to chapter 8 in the book, which deals with regulation of big businesses and antitrust. It's slightly redundant because antitrust is one form of regulation. So, but there are other forms of business regulation when it comes to controlling the behavior of monopolies and big businesses. Remind ourselves of the basic theoretical concepts of competition and monopoly. And we'll see what kind of theory, what kind of conception of competition and monopoly is used as a justification for regulating big businesses. So it's not, this is one contentious issue. It's not simple and straightforward that big businesses require some special regulation that is not required for other types of businesses. This is one contentious issue. So try to lay out the arguments for and against. And as a part of that, we will see what kind of theoretical rationale is used by the people who do want to regulate big businesses, economists and politicians alike. Then with that in mind, we will make a brief overview of some regulatory or standard classical regulatory schemes that we used throughout modern American history to regulate big businesses. Regulation examples. We use mostly the examples of interstate commerce commission, civil railroad court regulated airline industry. So see, these would be the case studies in a sense. What happens when you decide to use the government to control the big business? What kind of intended and unintended consequences happen? So these two examples are very instructive. So they're representative of what happens in general in other cases as well. And finally, the third topic for today is antitrust laws. Antitrust laws simply means laws against private monopolies. So there are many of them, and the first one was enacted in 1890, and then it's been amended in the meantime. So we'll see what these laws are, what they purport to achieve, what are the results of antitrust laws, what are some of the controversies. The antitrust laws antitrust laws are American invention. So they didn't exist anywhere in the world before Americans introduced them in the 1890s. Nowadays, every modern country has some kind of laws. They go by different names in different parts of the world. In Europe, it's called competition laws, laws protecting competition against monopolies. In America, we keep this old 19th century term antitrust. So trusts were big firms that were taking monopolies in the late 19th century, so hence the very term antitrust. Okay, so essentially you see that the topic for today's discussion is essentially the relationship between competition and monopoly, then what governments can do and what governments do in order to preserve or protect and punish or hinder or limit the influence of monopolies. So let's start first, something that I mentioned towards the end of the last class, but now I will remind us and go a few steps further, the analysis of competition and monopoly. There are two ways of defining competition and then monopoly as its counterpart. Monopoly as a denial or negation of competition. Historically speaking, monopoly was defined in law, in Roman law, in British common law, in all traditional legal systems, in Islamic Sharia. Islamic Sharia is a legal code that covers also economics. You're familiar with all those unpopular aspects of Islamic Sharia pertaining to personal liberties and so on, but Islamic Sharia is a much larger body of laws that covers also monopoly. So all these traditional legal codes define monopoly in one simple fashion. That's monopoly is a government-granted privilege. That means I have a permit to do a certain type of business that everybody else is prohibited by law from doing it. Government-granted privilege. The very term privilege is comes from Latin. It's right of law. Privilege. That's a law that doesn't apply equally to everybody. Like a law against murder or theft is a general law, because it lays out some general rules of conduct and applies them equally to everybody. Whoever commits murder is liable, is criminally liable, no matter his identity or political position. The private laws or privileges are laws, regulations that offer certain special, and now even don't have other words, privileges that offer certain specific rights to one person or a group of persons that nobody else has. The monopoly is one of those. I have a right to import salt here, this country. Nobody else has that right. I have a right to print paper money. No other bank has a right to print paper money. If they try doing so, they're going to end up in jail. So that's traditional view of what is monopoly. It's always associated with the government force and government restriction of free competition. So then consequently, what is competition? It's very simple. It's the absence of government-imposed restrictions and barriers. Business. It's just free rivalry between economic agents, firms or individuals, doesn't matter. Once the traditional understanding that survived its own quarters in modern economic theory as well, once you abolish government prohibitions and restrictions of free competition, you have taken care of monopoly. There is no problem of monopoly remaining after you abolish government. Whatever results from competition from this competitive play, free rivalry between economic agents is good. If that means that we will end up with only one firm on the market, so be it. Or five firms of 10,000. Doesn't matter. What matters is the process whereby we reach any particular result. If the process is tainted by government privileges, that's bad. And we should abolish government privileges. If there are no government privileges, any result is good as any other. Those people are free to compete. I'm slightly here simplifying, but not very much. There are some small exceptions. We'll see later on, but in principle, that's how it works. Common law. Now, the second view of competition is that, sorry to say, economists were responsible for, is the view that says monopoly can emerge both by government privileges and restrictions, as well as by the inherent market developments. There could be such a thing as a free market. There are private monopolies as well. And this view of competition, we can call it structural view of competition. That means that the competition is not a state of free rivalry. It's not primarily understood as a state of free, unimpeded rivalry, but rather market structure. What is a market structure? Market structure is the conceptualization of the market which asks how many firms are there. So competitive market structure is structure in which you have a large number of firms. One of the classical models of economics is so-called perfect competition. Very term suggests that this is good. There's an infinite number of firms. More the better. Larger number of firms competing, stronger the competition is. So, competitive market structure. That's good. Large number of firms. What is monopoly? Monopolistic market structure is a state of affairs in which you have one firm. That's the definition. And it doesn't matter so much whether this one firm is product, whether this result is a product of government restriction that nobody who would want to compete is legally prohibited from competing, or a result of free competition in which one firm establishes itself as a monopoly remains. Monopolistic structure. One firm. And you have a variety of intermediate stages, which you have a small number of firms. So it's not competition where you have a large number of firms. It's not a monopoly either where you have just one firm. You have a small number of firms. That's called a oligopoly. Imperfect competition. Oligopoly means a few. Oligos means few in number. You know, it's an oligarchy. The rule by a selected group of people, clique. So oligopoly is a situation where you have a small number of firms controlling the market. What is the economic theory behind these conclusions here? The economic theory is if you have a market and you have a large number of firms that compete against each other, the demand curve of that firm will be horizontal. What does that mean is that this firm with a relatively horizontal demand curve will have little ability to charge high prices of their products without losing customers. So if this is the demand curve you're facing, let's say that this is the price at which you are selling, okay, price 1. This is the quantity that you will sell at this price. Let's say that you increase price, okay, 20–30%. You try to increase price to exploit consumers, to charge higher prices. What's going to happen to you if the demand curve is like this? You will see a reduction in your quantity that you sell, decline in volume of trade that you engage, which will be 60–70%. So small increase in price leads to large decline in revenue, large decline in quantity product. This demand curve, relatively horizontal, is called elastic. The small change in price that you charge will lead to big changes in quantity sold. That means that buyers have typically good alternatives. If you charge higher price, they're going to stop buying from you and they will turn to other competitors. So in a competitive market in which there are multiple, ideally a large number of sellers, buyers can pick and choose and can punish promptly everyone who increases their price. Because the demand for their product is elastic. It means it changes, it stretches significantly with the price movement. So if the price goes up just a little bit, your sales will go down dramatically. If you cut your price slightly, your sales will go up. But that means that the demand for your product is elastic. And this is competitive in the competitive market. This is what things look like. According to the conventional theory that underlies these conclusions here, you have to do something about monopolies on a free market are bad, and they require government intervention and regulation to protect competition. On the contrary, in a monopolistic market, right here, we have a relatively vertical demand, so inelastic. That means it changes very little. The quantity that you sell will change very little as a function of a variation in price. If you increase your price greatly, quantity of product that you lose, the number of sales that you lose will be very low. So let's say here, price, low price. This is the quantity. So this low price. Now let's say that you increase your price 120%. See how small reduction in your revenue is, in your volume of sales. So that means that this firm, if a firm faces a demand curve like this, then it can get away with charging much higher prices without much risk of losing customers. It is understood that this is what characterizes monopolistic, just a situation of a monopolistic market. It's vertical demand. Which essentially means I can charge high prices, you're stuck with me, you have no alternative. Or you have very little. Very few. So then the idea is if you leave things as they are here, if it's like this, then everything is fine. There is competition, government doesn't need to do it. However, if the situation corresponds to this picture here, then we need government intervention. Of some kind. Regulation of business, regulation of prices. The first, one more thing before we go to this. The first economist who developed this theory, who even argued that even if you have a competition and you do nothing, eventually you will end up more likely than not in a monopoly. that the free market capitalism, as if by the law, leads to monopolistic capitalism. It's Karl Marx in the 1860s, 1870s. This book, Das Kapital. And this view became popular towards the end of the 19th century. This view that free competition cannot be left to its own devices. If we leave capitalism to work normally unimpeded by government regulation, it will result sooner or later, more likely than not, those types of pathological situations where customers, consumers are at the mercy of exploitative monopolies. Now, the first ideas about what to do about monopolies is to impose some kind of government commission or governmental agency to regulate its behavior, to regulate its prices, to prevent them from charging too high prices. So that's a very widespread pattern of anti-monopolistic regulation or anti-monopolistic government action to impose a special government agency to control price behavior, price schedules. So the first such agency that was formed in the United States was called Interstate Commerce Commission in 1888, I believe, even before the antitrust laws. And the explicit purpose of this commission was to regulate the freight rates of railroads. Railroad companies were considered to be monopolistic, charged too high prices. So the Interstate Commerce Commission was created with a specific mandate to regulate the prices of railroad tickets, to prevent the railroads from exploiting consumers. And now this is one of the things that you have to bear in mind always. Whenever you create a governmental bureaucracy to take care of competition or to watch over monopolists, sooner or later it will show a tendency to become an agency that protects the existing. So what happened with the Interstate Commerce Commission is that eventually, step by step, it was transformed into an agency that protected monopoly railroads. For example, in 1935, in 1920s and 1930s, a new powerful competition to railroads emerged. Trucks. So trucks then could transport goods at a cheaper price than railroads. They started competing with railroads and eating away at their market share, their domination of the market. And what the Interstate Commerce Commission did, what eventually Congress did in 1935, they passed a law and said, oh, now, you know what? Now we're going to regulate the truck industry. We're going to regulate the truckers. And what did that mean? Was essentially that you will have to get a special permission from the Interstate Commerce Commission if you want to drive your trucks, to use them to transport goods across state lines. So you cannot just drive from New Jersey to New York or from North Dakota to South Dakota and transport wherever you want. You have to ask for special permission from the Interstate Commerce Commission. There are all kinds of perverse situations in which people who drive from Baltimore to Philadelphia would get the permit, but the trucks that drive from New York to Washington, D.C. wouldn't get the permit, although it's the same highway that they were using, the same region of the country. Or you would get the permission to transport goods from New York to Philadelphia, but not from Philadelphia to New York. So then you drive full load from New York to Philadelphia, then you have to drive back empty, so that means that your business is going to be unprofitable, so then you're going to have to shut down the whole New York-Philadelphia line because the bureaucrats prohibited you from transporting energy in the other direction. And so it very quickly became obvious that the purpose of this 1935 law was not to control any monopoly, but to protect the monopoly of the railroads that trucks were threatened. That's what's called the political economy of government intervention into monopolies. Why do you think that this happened? One simple explanation is that once you create a governmental body to oversee what you do, whoever you are, some specific industry, let's say railroads, then the industry will increase investment in lobbying activities to sway the regulatory body to do their own bit. That's called in economic theory state capture. So you create a state agency that has to watch over business, and then private business captures this agency and makes it do its own duty, direct or indirect. So then eventually Interstate Commerce Commission that began as an agency controlling the railroads and trying to make sure that the railroads were not charging too high prices, ended up being an agency enforcing the railroad monopoly and preventing, by abusing the law, competitors from undermining. So that's one of the dangers that always exist when you want to use regulatory mechanisms to limit monopolistic behavior. Aeronautic Board, similar aeronautic board, also a regulatory agency created in 1930s after the Second World War to control the prices airfares, the prices of airline tickets. And eventually, after the Second World War, those prices were extraordinarily high. So you know the term jet set. Flying an airplane was a privilege. Only very wealthy people could afford to fly. 1950s, 1960s. Jet set was a term for very wealthy people who can afford to use jets. It was heavily regulated. It was even cartelized. That means that there were multiple firms that the government forced them to agree among themselves about which prices are they going to charge. And if some company was charging a lower price, they would be punished. And all of that lasted until 1970s. And Jimmy Carter got a bad rep as a bad president. He did two very important things. He abolished the truck regulations, essentially abolished the right of Interstate Commerce Commission to regulate trucks. They simply exploded in the 1970s, transportation by trucks, and the railroads were essentially done at that time. And he abolished the single aeronautic boards. He regulated business and prices of airline industries. And now, what is the result of what we have right now? Prices. It's 2 times more expensive to go from Seattle to Chicago by train than by an airplane. And 3 times, 4 times. So these are some of the examples actually to see that there is nothing as enduring, nothing as persistent as a temporary government program. That's one thing. And another one is that any agency tasked with overseeing a monopoly or a cartel very quickly becomes an agency protecting and enforcing the cartel. And there are multiple examples that in American economic history. These are just 2 of them. This is a more draconian approach. They have a direct sector regulation. That means that the government enacts particular sets of laws and regulation that apply to a specific sector, trucking industry, or railroads, or airline industry, and so on. Antitrust laws are of different kind. They are universal. That means that they apply to the entire economy, to every aspect of business, all business sectors. Now, what antitrust laws mean? They don't mean that monopoly is prohibited in and of itself. That means that theoretically you can have monopolistic position, be the only firm on the market, and not being targeted as a monopolist. So what is punishable by law, according to antitrust laws, is not the existence of the monopoly, but the abuse of the monopolistic position, abuse of the dominant position. Now, what counts as an abuse of the monopolistic position is a very big question. It's not very clear. What is that? So antitrust laws is a generic term for a variety of different laws that were passed from 1890 until 1980s, 1990s, that criminalize different aspects of business behavior that are considered to be illicit. So the first one among them, anyone knows what was the first antitrust law passed? It's called Sherman Antitrust Act. Sherman, after Senator Sherman, who was a sponsor of that law. By the way, brother of General Sherman, John Sherman. Sherman Act of 1890. What it prohibited was essentially conspiracies or collusion to fix prices, cartel collusion to fix prices. The phrase they use, all agreements in restraint of trade. Agreements in restraint of trade. It could be all agreements that we reduce production. Let's say 3 of us are the only firms in the market. If we agree we are not going to produce more than a certain quantity in order to increase the price for our products. Or we agree more commonly, more often, we agree that we are not going to sell below a certain price. We are not going to compete. That's called collusion in the antitrust or conspiracy, fixed prices, price fixing. Now, the difference, when I said before that there's some small nuances in the old view of monopoly that I said in general it means no government control, no government restrictions, means there is no monopoly. This small nuance or small exception was one thing, that is inability to enforce price fixing agreements to courts. That means in the common law, before 1890, before the antitrust laws, if a couple of firms make an agreement to fix prices, you could do that. You would not end up in jail if it's been discovered that you did it, but you cannot enforce the agreement in courts, which means that if 3 of us make an agreement, we're not going to sell widgets below $10, and I start selling them for $7. You cannot sue me in court for breaking the agreement. So it's allowed as an informal agreement, but it's not enforceable in court. That was a common law treatment of cartel collusions or price fixing agreements. Sherman Act changed that and said, no, even whatever you do, if we discover that you try to make an agreement, a price fixing agreement, you're going to end up in jail. It's categorically prohibited. It's criminally punishable. Even to try and make cartel agreement, let alone to enforce it. The variety of other laws were proposed in the meantime, punishing or criminalizing different other activities, different other abuses of the dominant position. acquisition. So I will now list a couple of main infractions, a couple of main technical categories of antitrust law. So the first is price fixing or agreements in restraint of trade. That's prohibited by the German law. But other things as well, or punishable under certain circumstances. Price discrimination. Price discrimination, that's a practice of charging different prices to different customers.
Can you explain again what the Sherman Act was?
So the Sherman Act was the first antitrust law that prohibited all, the technical term that they use, the quote unquote, all agreements in restraint of trade. That meant practically two things. Agreements to limit production. So we impose quotas. Three of us are the only producers. We say we're not going to produce more than such and such quantity in order to increase demand, to increase price. Or it could be price fixed, which means that we make an agreement, we're not going to sell below $10. So other antitrust acts, such as Clayton Act of 1912, before this antitrust legislation, it outlawed price discrimination, for example, or exclusive dealing. That means I'm going to sell you my product, but I'm not going to sell you. Refusal, selective refusal to deal is considered under certain circumstances. Then another thing under the Clayton Act. It's a revision or amending of the Sherman Act was integration, control of horizontal and vertical integrations. What does that mean? It means, remember the theory. It's a bad thing if you have one big firm controlling the entire market. It's good to have as many competing firms as possible. So now, any market process that leads to the more concentrated market structure, which means smaller number of firms controlling larger part of the market, are considered to be bad. Or at least bad under certain circumstances. I'll explain in a moment what does it mean under certain circumstances. Why not always? And those processes that lead to a more concentrated market structure could be threefold. It could be an internal growth of a firm. A firm appears and it just grows and grows internally and becomes large and swallows the entire market. That's not very likely to happen, but it could happen. Other two forms though. Growth could be horizontal integrations and vertical integrations. What are horizontal integrations? I'm a car manufacturer, you're a car manufacturer, you're a car manufacturer. I buy you two firms and you become part of my own. That's horizontal integration. Let's call it acquisition. One form of horizontal. Horizontal integrations are integrations of firms that operate at the same stage of production. Car manufacturers, whatever, retail businesses, wholesale, at the same stage of production. Toyota buys whatever, General Motors, that would be horizontal, that would be acquisition. Or it could be merger. That means we agree that we merge into one big. Nobody buys nobody else, but merger. So that obviously can be anti-competitive. It's better to have 3 firms than 1 firm. So under certain circumstances. Also, vertical integrations, they're considered to be less problematic, but still there could be a problem. Vertical integrations are integrations of the firms that operate along the same production process, different stages of the same production process. Remember, John D. Rockefeller was a master of vertical integration. So oil drilling, oil refineries, oil distributional network retail. So you integrate into one big firm all 3 or 4 stages of production of the same. So that's vertical integration. Now, one thing to bear in mind, in antitrust laws, the only behaviors, the only actions that are categorically prohibited, that means no matter what, you are simply not allowed to do, is price fixing. That's called per se illegality, which means it's illegal per se. Whenever you do it, however you do it, in whatever circumstances you do it or try to do it, it's illegal. There are no exceptions. Most other business practices and behaviors are not per se illegal, but they could be illegal under certain circumstances, which depend on the discretionary judgment by the judges and regulators. That means whether horizontal integration, merger, is anti-competitive or pro-competitive will depend on the assessment of its effects that is made by the judges. What this assessment involves. So when you increase the size of the firm, there are costs of that and there are benefits. So what are the costs? The usual costs, the usual way how economists understand the costs of increasing the size of the firm or increasing the concentration of the market is that you decrease the elasticity of demand for the product. You increase what is called market power. If 3 of us are supplying the rest of you, you have more choice and we have less ability. Every one of us individually has less ability to charge higher prices with impunity without fear of losing your consumers. That means that the demand for our individual products is more elastic, more sensitive to our price behavior, to whatever we do with our prices. If I buy 2 of their firms and I'm the only guy who controls the entire business, then I have a greater market power. I have a greater ability to charge higher prices without losing your support, without losing money. So that means this is always the cost of horizontal integration. When you make the market structure more concentrated, you always, to some degree, decrease the elasticity of demand for. You make those firms, those new larger firms, more powerful in its ability to extract higher prices from consumers. But this is balanced against the benefits of increase in size. And those benefits are called, very simple name, economies of scale. That means a larger firm can afford to produce at lower per unit cost, to sell at a lower price. That's the economy of scale. Larger the scale of the operation, per unit costs, per unit of product are typically lower. So as a monopolist, as a larger firm, although you can charge higher prices because you control the market more, you also in the same time can charge a lower price because your costs are lower. Now, what is the cost-benefit analysis? Whether to allow or not to allow a merger or a horizontal integration is that they try to figure out which one of these 2 effects will be larger. Whether the savings or benefits to consumers from economies of scale, that this firm can produce and sell at lower costs, or costs or negative effects because the firm has a greater ability to control the market and charge higher prices. It's a very complicated technical analysis, and there is no easy way of knowing in advance whether a merger or integration will be efficient or not. But this is the reason why integrations of any kind, including the horizontal integrations, are not a prohibited category, because they have some benefits as well. And that the balance of the costs and benefits of horizontal integrations have to be taken into account when you, as a government, allow a merger to proceed. So everyone who wants to, there was one example a few years ago, the German pharmaceutical giant Bayer Leverkusen bought Monsanto. Anyone else what Monsanto was? A major American firm specializing in making genetically modified seeds and also pharmaceutical products and all kinds of things. Bayer Leverkusen bought. And there was a very, very long process of the Federal Trade Commission actually and Department of Justice approving this. And it was determined that these cost savings, that the new firm that Bayer together and Monsanto will have the ability to increase the productivity and to lower the prices much more than their market power will increase in the American market. If they found differently, they would have prohibited the place. It was actually acquisition. So Bayer bought Monsanto. It was not a merger. So this is a modern approach. The last 34 years. Before 1950s or 1960s, antitrust policy was much harsher. The likelihood that a merger or integration would be allowed or taken seriously was much lower. The approach back then was simply look at the market structure by using a simple index. Okay. Concentration ratio. What does that mean? What is concentration ratio? It's simply you take the sales figures for three largest firms in an industry, whatever the industry is, and you calculate, you add them up. And then you divide this number by the total sales figures for the industry as a whole. And you get a certain number which is lower than 100%. So then if it's 30%, 0.3, and you divide three largest firms, all firms, that means that the concentration ratio is 3%. The three largest firms control 30% of the market, or control 30% of the sales, total sales. 20% would have been better because it's a less concentrated market. They have a lower power. 80% of total sales are outside of this cartel of three big firms, or 40% worse. So, for example, what was the effect of this? What were some of the effects of this? Henry Ford said in a couple of interviews that he reduced production, the total number of cars made by Ford Motor Company many years, in order to avoid going above 25% of market share. Because he was afraid of being targeted by antitrust as a monopolist. See now, what is the effect of that for the American consumer? That the number one producer of cars is reluctant to increase investment that he could have done. He has the money, has the all necessary preconditions to do that, but he was reluctant to do stuff because he was afraid he will be targeted as a monopolist by the government. Essentially, that was a very harsh approach that used market structure as the only, by and large, only criterion of monopolization. And they use some arbitrary benchmarks at 25% concentration ratio, 30%. Ever since 1960s and especially 1970s, this much more elastic approach was taken, that you have to take into account the benefits of product. Paradoxically speaking, there are benefits of large size of firm as well, not only the cost. One more practice here, it's predatory pricing. Predatory prices. It is prohibited. Again, it's not categorically prohibited because it's not quite clear what is that. So in theory, the definition of predatory prices is actually that I cut my prices significantly in order to drive my small competitors out of the business, out of the market, because they cannot keep up with me. And once they're outside, they're out, then I'm going to raise prices and make up for the losses that I'm making, and then I will enjoy my monopolistic position freely, and will charge even higher prices because I don't have competition anymore. That's a predatory pricing. I strategically cut prices for a while until I bankrupt my smaller competitors who cannot afford to charge low prices even for a short period of time. And once they're gone, then I jack up prices and I start exploiting consumers because now I don't have any competition. So if they catch you doing that, you are toast. You're going to end up in jail. Now the problem is that what could be the problem in this? If you want to enforce it like objectively as a judge, and somebody sues me for engaging in predatory prices, what is your main problem in determining whether I did it or not? Whether I should be sent to jail or not? What is it that I've done? Cut prices, reduce prices. How is that bad? How are you going to distinguish between an evil predatory price exploiter wanted to drive out small competitors from a regular competition that I undercut you in order to take consumers' market share? So one and the same type of behavior could be a crime or could be a wholesome behavior depending on the interpretation of the meaning or my future intentions. So now cutting prices becomes risky. It could be criminal under certain circumstances. There is a joke about three businessmen in jail, and they're explaining why are they in jail. One says, "Oh, I was sent to jail because I were abusing my monopolistic position to charge higher prices." The other one says, "I'm in jail because I engaged in predatory pricing. I was charging lower prices." And the third one was in jail because he was making the price fixing agreements to charge the same prices. So whatever you do, whether you charge high, low, or medium prices, you can end up in jail depending on circumstances. You're not 100% safe against the antitrust prosecution. So the problem with predatory prices, number one, difficulty in enforcing it, is that you don't know how to distinguish between that behavior and competitive behavior. At the surface, the guy is cutting prices. You have to second guess his future intentions in order to make sure that the behavior is predatory or not. And the second and more important problem is that the whole conception is based on the idea that once you remove the existing competition, no competition will show up whatever you do. So imagine that I drive my competition out, and then I start charging prices 3%, 40%. Right? So what's going to happen is a consequence of that. What will happen is a consequence of that. People who are out of business now can enter the market. Remember our fracking story, supply curve. That when price is low, only the most efficient firms can afford to sell. That's why the quantity supplied in the market will be very low when the price is low, because only the most efficient firms, only the most efficient production processes will be profitable. Only if you can produce and sell at a price which is lower than the market price, if your costs are lower than the price, you can afford to sell. So now this is the price where I drove down the market in my predatory pricing scheme. And now I'm alone in the market. Everybody's out, nobody else can afford to sell at such low, ridiculous low prices. And now I'm celebrating instead, now I'm gonna jack up price here. And now I'm gonna enjoy forever my monopolistic position because nobody can beat me. Except that now you see supply curves here now, the firms that can afford to sell at much higher prices here. It's an invitation. Increasing prices is an invitation to potential competitors. So it's very doubtful that you can, even if you can manage to drive the existing competition out from the market, the only way for you actually to retain your position would be to keep prices as low or to lower them even further. Because if you do otherwise, if you start jacking up prices to exploit consumers, eventually competition will show up. People will enter the market. People will enter the market in which you operate, or alternatively, or in the same time, people will be moving from your product to some other product, to some substitute. I sell apple juice, and I predatory priced out everybody from the apple juice industry, and I'm the only guy who controls the supply of apples in the world. I produce apple juice and I charge $300 per bottle or per pack. And you're stuck with me and nobody can do anything about it. No, it's the other way around. Other people, even if no other apple producer can enter the market, you will start buying orange juice or beer or something else. So these two effects then limit the ability of this monopolies to maintain monopolistic position that was created by predatory pricing. And actually, when you look, history is a teacher of life, as wise Latins Romans said. So again, John D. Rockefeller is starting historical view. So what he did at one point in the late 1870s, he monopolized the entire oil market. He was controlling more than 90%. And then what did he do in the next 22 years? We look at the prices and the volume of production of oil products in America. It increased, and the prices were going down and down and down, decade after decade, in spite of John D. Rockefeller being essentially a monopolist, more than 90% market share. So do you think that he was a stupid guy who couldn't realize that he can exploit now, once he drove out competition from the business, that he could exploit it by charging extraordinarily high prices for kerosene? He was an idiot who couldn't figure that out, but continued to lower prices and costs. No, he was not an idiot. He knew exactly that the moment he starts increasing prices, competition will show up and his monopolistic position will be threatened. The only way to protect your monopolistic position was to keep prices as low as possible, to increase production as quickly as possible, and to constantly innovate. So that's one of the major weaknesses of antitrust laws, that they don't take into account this. They don't always take economic theory. and even economic history. Another general problem that cannot be solved within the antitrust policy. Let's say the precondition for somebody to be charged with monopolistic behavior is to define that person as a monopolist, as 3% market share, 80% market share, and then see whether business firm abuses its monopolistic position. So that's the general concept. The main problem is that it's not clear what is the market, the share of which you should be held for. What is the market? What is the market for, let's say, for apple juice? We want to make sure that my market share is not greater than 60%. But what is the market in which I compete? Is it the market for apple juice? If I have 90% market share in the apple juice industry, my sales are 90% of total sales of apple juice in America. Does that mean that I'm a monopolist? What do you think? Why yes or why no? That's the market. Market for apple juice, I control 90% of the sales. Simple question, am I a monopolist? Who can compete against me? That could be follow-up question. Can orange juice producers compete against me? Do they compete against me? To some degree. If I increase price 3 times, how is that going to affect the prices of demand for substitutes? It will increase. So now the question that antitrust law has to answer but cannot answer. There is no way you can answer it objectively, scientifically. Is what is the relevant market? Whether somebody will be defined as a monopolist will crucially depend on how you define the relevant market. Relevant market is a market in which a firm competes. More narrowly you define the relevant market, more likely you're going to be to find monopolists everywhere. If you define my relevant market as a market for apple juice, and I control 90% of sales, I'm a monopolist. But if you expand the definition of relevant market so as to include orange juice and pear juice, then I may not be a monopolist. What about non-alcoholic beer? Is it a substitute for apple? Might be, might not be, depends on tastes and preferences and demand conditions in every given market that change from one point to another. Nobody knows what's going to be a substitute for anything else tomorrow, or day after tomorrow, or 3 years down the road. Then you want to define the relevant market without knowing the basic facts that can help you define the relevant. Then essentially the bottom line here is that the definition of the relevant market that the antitrust lawyers and the Department of Justice, bureaucrats and judges use are essentially right. Your guess is that's what we find. That's a problem. It's a problem because you want the rule of law means that there are general rules publicly announced that everybody understands, and I know what is the crime. I know how to protect myself against being prosecuted for murder because I know what murder is, and if I avoid killing anyone, I won't be prosecuted for murder. The same applies for theft, rape, and all other classical crimes. Here, it's not clear. Whether I'm going to be the criminal ending up in jail or paying high fines that will destroy my business will depend on how some person who might not be particularly impartial, or even if he was impartial, cannot know the facts by definition, how that person will define my relevant market. It's a flip of a coin. And I have to invest my money and resources and capital in production, risking that somebody will eventually punish me and destroy me financially because they thought that I'm a monopolist, because of the way how they define the relevant market. So that's a problem from a standpoint of the rule of law. Antitrust laws are problematic because the infractions or the crimes in antitrust laws are not clearly defined in advance. You don't know what is the crime, what constitutes criminal behavior. So fortunately, they're not enforced with its high level of stringency in these decades. But you have cases from time to time. Microsoft were subject to antitrust litigation in 1990s. IBM before it. Now people are clamoring about applying antitrust laws against Facebook, Twitter, Amazon, Google, corporate giants. Whenever we have, in every generation, we have some, what is the term, scapegoats, corporate scapegoats. The largest firms that grow fastest would typically be either prosecuted or threatened by antitrust law. Sometimes for political reasons, sometimes for wanting to stick to the big line, stick to the corporate fat cats. Okay, so that was the basics of antitrust policy. So bear in mind these two concepts of competition and monopoly, and those basic practices of antitrust. Regulation, those examples of interstate commerce commission, and these 4 or 5 practices of antitrust that are prohibited and how are they. Plus the definition of relevant market. That definition is very useful for you because it contains a variety of other concepts. You can understand quite a bit of economic theory just by understanding what the relevant market is. You can understand the concept of substitution and elasticity and the price and demand and all kinds of things in the same time just by understanding what is the relevant market and how it is different. Okay. If there are no further questions, then let's call today and we'll see. So the homework will be next weekend will be the previous chapter plus this chapter. Okay. Chapter 7 and 8.